Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the chance to get together. It's good to see everyone in person. It's been a while for some of us. We've been looking at each other through the computer for the last year, but thanks for the chance to talk about the work that we're doing to make sure that voter fraud continues to be exceedingly rare in Ohio. And the good news is this: voter fraud is rare in Ohio. One of the reasons it's rare is because we've got good laws on the books and we faithfully carry out those laws. In fact, in this case, we're talking about a law that I sponsored in 2016 as a member of the state Senate. This is the same bill that created online voter registration in Ohio, but it also included an important provision which received bipartisan support, in fact, broad bipartisan support, that creates the system that we're now carrying out, and we've carried out previously in my administration as well, that requires us to follow a multi-step process to make sure that only citizens are registered to vote in the state of Ohio. The process that we followed is a very thoughtful one that involves using the records of the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles that maintains records about citizenship status. And when we can verify that someone was a non-citizen and then conducted some act such as voting or registering to vote, and then that they again verified that their citizenship status has them as a non-citizen. When that occurs, we then follow up with a letter. In that case, the letter is sometimes responded to. The individual in question will withdraw their voter registration or what have you. When they don't, then the decision that I've made is to refer those to the Ohio Attorney General's office, and that's exactly what we're doing here. And so today we're referring to the Ohio Attorney General a total of 117 cases of suspected voter fraud. Again, out of a state of nearly 8 million registered voters, that's a small number, but again, the reason why Ohio has such secure and honest elections is because we carry out the laws like this. 104 of these cases are for being a registered voter while also a non-citizen, and 13 of these cases are for actually casting a ballot as a non-citizen. Again, we'll point out that this is a bill that was passed in 2016 with broad bipartisan support. It's section 3503.15H of the Ohio Revised Code. Creates a fifth-degree felony for those registering as a non-citizen and a fourth degree for those who actually cast a ballot. The bottom line is this: citizenship matters. It's an important status. It's something that we should all treasure. And with that comes the ability to be a voter. We want all Ohioans who are eligible to be able to cast a ballot, but certainly that means only citizens are able to do so. And that's why we've referred these to the Attorney General today, so that he can further investigate those and then take the next step as he sees fit. With that, happy to take any questions that you all have for me.
On the legal side of things, it goes to him, not individual county prosecutors. Why is that, and what would his steps be?
Yeah. So it goes to the Attorney General. The Attorney General can then, at his discretion, refer those on to the county prosecutor, and I think in the past that has been his practice in many cases. But we're not an agency that has the investigatory power that the Attorney General has. And so through BCI and other tools that the Attorney General has, his office can then further investigate these matters and then decide, and they have that discretion about whether they want to pursue prosecution or not.
These referrals have been going on now for a few years. Could you give us an idea about how many convictions we've had and what the results of those have been?
Yeah, so this is something that I was interested in as well. And so our legal counsel followed up and has been sort of in close contact with the Attorney General's office. What we got back was kind of a spreadsheet that shows the disposition of these. In many cases, they were referred on to the county prosecutors, but we don't have hard numbers as far as how many have been prosecuted. That's something that the Attorney General's office may be able to provide. But my admonition to all of our county prosecutors is this: if you've been referred these cases, I'd ask you to take them seriously. Again, the reason why this is such an important matter is because Ohioans need to know that we run an honest election and that we keep election fraud rare by prosecuting it when it occurs. And so if you are a county prosecutor who has received one of these referrals, I'd ask you to give it very careful consideration, and if there again is cause to pursue prosecution, I'd ask you to do so.
Is there any way that these were honest mistakes, or do you feel that these were maliciously intended?
Well, I tell you what, I can't tell you what the actual intent was. I can tell you that in some cases, what we find is that an honest mistake occurred. I'll give you an example of this. Somebody comes into a Bureau of Motor Vehicles office and they're there to update their state ID or update their driver's license or renew it. In many cases, they're handed the voter registration form because that's one of the ways that Ohio complies with the Motor Voter Act, right? And there's a couple different ways that they do that. Some BMVs, they just sort of have a stack of them down at the end of the counter, and others, they hand you one. Let's say that you're somebody that may have a limited English proficiency. If you're handed a form by somebody at a government agency, you're probably inclined to fill it out. We've seen instances where somebody would fill the form out completely accurately, and then at the bottom, there's the question that says, are you a United States citizen? And they would also answer that honestly. They would check no, which then therefore basically invalidates the form that they just filled out. In some cases, we've seen where a Board of Elections would receive that and then not verify that, not get to that part as they're doing their data entry, so that person would get processed and registered through no fault of their own. That's one of those examples. But the reason why this is such a serious matter is that registering to vote or voting as a non-citizen constitutes a felony, which makes you subject to deportation, right? So that's one of the reasons why we want to be so careful about this, because if someone has filled out a voter registration form in error, we want them to withdraw their registration. That's why we send them all a letter that says you are listed as a registered voter. We also have your status as non-citizen, so you should withdraw your registration if that is the case, or you should confirm to us that you are now a U.S. citizen. That's why we follow that very thoughtful process to make sure that we're not doing this haphazardly. And there have been problems with other states that didn't do it as carefully as Ohio has. But again, this is just another one of those examples where I think that Ohio has a very thoughtful, measured process that other states should look at as well.
Are you aware of, there was the incident of the example in Delaware County, I believe, where somebody filled out some, like deceased relatives ballot or something like that. Are you aware of any instances in this election besides that of people casting a ballot that wasn't theirs, or possibly voting in Ohio, voting in another state, which they don't check that election officials do?
Yeah, so the example that occurred in Delaware County is just a prime example of how the system works, right? Our county boards of elections review the information that they're presented. If anyone has evidence of election fraud, they should bring it to their county board of elections, and the county board of elections can then pursue it with the county prosecutor. As far as a rundown of all the instances where that has occurred, I don't have that. I do know that there have been a handful in other counties where the county board of elections has cause to believe that something wrong has occurred, and then they've referred that to the county prosecutor, and then the county prosecutor goes through their process to actually do the investigation.
So a handful, like less than 5?
I don't have an exact number, Andy. Yeah.
Are these numbers for the primary and the general election?
This is, yeah, correct. This 117 that you see here is the numbers from last year's cycle conducted this year.
And then I guess what process is in place to keep someone from voting who's a non-citizen? Like these 13 people, should that have been caught at the registration level? How does that work?
Interesting you mentioned that. This is something that I've been working to try to get done here in the legislature for a while, and that is to modernize the way that we do voter registration at the BMV. Again, right now, when you go into a BMV, a Bureau of Motor Vehicles office, we comply with motor voter by making voter registration available, right? And so the way that we make voter registration available is usually with just a hard copy piece of paper, always, that is handed to the voter, to the driver or person in question. With that, it does not include the ability to verify citizenship on the front end, right? What I'm proposing and what we're trying to get done is a more streamlined process where we can verify citizenship right there at the time that we do the registration. That would be a far superior process to this kind of look back that we have through this process right now. But again, the biggest deterrent is the fact that it's a felony, and nobody who's here would want to risk their legal status by conducting an illegal vote, right? And so the deterrent factor of the enforcement of this is important.
I'm not familiar with his arguments, but Dr. Frank was a guy who spoke at the Lorraine County Fairgrounds at the Trump rally, and it was reported that your office met with him to talk about whatever his concerns are about voter fraud. Why did your office have that meeting? What did you guys talk about? And generally, what's sort of your assessment of voter fraud in Ohio? Which is something that people have talked a lot about, and it's become a concern whether or not it's happened.
First of all, the bottom line is that Ohioans should know that voter fraud is exceedingly rare. Ohioans should know that our voting machines are never connected to the internet. They should know that when we conduct a post-election audit, which we do after every election, last year's post-election audit showed a 99.98% accuracy rate. There's a whole variety of things that once Ohioans know them, gives them confidence about how our elections are conducted. Why did we meet with this group? First of all, I wasn't in the meeting, but our A team from our office was, everyone from my chief of staff to our elections director, legal counsel. We take these kind of things seriously. And so when there's a group of citizens that raises a concern, we're going to meet with them. We're going to vet those concerns out. But it has been very clearly proven time and again that those concerns that he raises are not valid here in Ohio. In fact, there was a Republican Senate committee in Michigan that investigated the same kind of concerns and found that there's no basis for them. They're kind of predicated on these ideas like voting machines being connected to the internet that are demonstrably disprovable, right? You can very clearly show that Ohio's voting machines are never connected to the internet, and so we're going to take that kind of thing seriously. When somebody makes allegations like that, we're going to meet with them, and thankfully here, those allegations were very easily disproven.
What do you think is going to happen to these 117 people, and what do you hope happens to them?
Yeah, I hope a thoughtful investigation occurs, and I know that there will be at the Attorney General's office. And again, when there's cause to show that an illegal act occurred, I hope that there's a prosecution. That's what should happen. That's why we have laws in place, and those laws should be faithfully carried out.
The 117, what did they actually do that is illegal? Did they register? Did they vote? Did they come back and vote again?
Yeah.
And is that number demonstrably higher than the last time you did this?
First of all, that number is very consistent with what we've seen in the past. My office has conducted this process before, and we saw a similar number at that point. 104 instances were for registering to vote as a non-citizen, which is in and of itself a crime. But even the more serious matter is when there are 13 cases here where we have cause to believe that an individual who is not a citizen actually cast a ballot, and those are obviously an even more serious matter.
In order to be found guilty of the felony, do you have to, is there a requirement that there's a knowing action here? Do these people have to know what they're doing is illegal?
Yeah, I don't believe that there is a sort of mens rea standard for knowing that what they're doing is illegal. It's one of those sort of strict liability. If you conduct the act, whether you knew it was illegal or not, it is a violation of Ohio's law. And again, all Ohioans should know that we want, first of all, we want people to join our big family by becoming a U.S. citizen, just as my great-grandfather did 80 years ago, and so many of our ancestors did. We want people to immigrate legally to this country and become part of our family. We want them, once they are citizens, to be a voter. In fact, I've been at those naturalization ceremonies, and it is such an emotional thing. We've been there with our voter registration table to get people registered to vote right after they take that oath of citizenship, and it's such a cool thing to see them be so excited to cast a ballot and be part of the process. But certainly, if you are not a citizen, you may not register, and if you are not a citizen, you may not vote in the state of Ohio, and that's what this is making clear.
And I think you said that the 104 people who were registered and are being referred, they did not respond to a letter that your agency sent, right?
That's correct, yeah, 2 letters. And in fact, we wanted to make very sure that we gave them every chance possible to withdraw their registration or to prove their citizenship. And it's a very simple sort of binary thing there. And in all of these cases, they failed to respond to 2 letters that went to their registration address.
How many individuals received the letters?
What was that number? My team can follow up with that. The total number that received the 163. 163 was the number. Okay.
I'm already seeing some of this in social media, but I think we're likely to hear from people who feel that you raising this issue in such a way about something that's rare is sort of giving an impression that something's happening when in fact it's rarely happening. Why do you decide to have press conferences and make announcements like this, given that it's a very rare event that you're talking about?
Well, to highlight the facts on this, there's unfortunately so many cases of hyperbole and exaggeration around elections these days, and people have politicized elections administration to a great extent that should never happen. You may have heard me say a couple weeks ago at the elections officials conference that elections are always political. They are by their very nature political, right? But elections administration must not be politicized. And in far too many cases, people are politicizing elections administration. One of my most important responsibilities as Ohio's chief elections officer is to work to just turn down that rhetoric and to reinforce to Ohioans that they should feel confident casting their ballot and knowing that it's going to be honestly counted. Ohio has this great balance that we've achieved, and not every other state has done this. In Ohio, it's very convenient to vote. If you're not voting in Ohio, for example, early voting is happening right now in both the 11th and the 15th congressional districts in those special elections. It is very easy to vote in Ohio. If you're not voting in Ohio, it's because you've simply chosen not to vote. But at the same time, it's a trustworthy process with bipartisan administration, with all sorts of oversight to make sure that safeguards are in place to prevent things from happening. And so what I want to do is make sure that the word gets out. And that's why I partner with you all in the media to make sure that we get accurate information out to Ohioans. And what Ohioans should know is that voter fraud is exceedingly rare in Ohio, but when it occurs, we take it seriously. In a state with nearly 8 million registered voters, we have found 117 cases here that we think potentially could constitute voter fraud, and we're referring them to the Attorney General. That's a fraction of a percent, right? And so it's important that I, in the first person, am able to get that word directly out to the people of Ohio so that they understand that this is a small fraction, but not something that we would ever take for granted. There's not such thing as any acceptable level of voter fraud. It's not like we say, well, okay, we're going to tolerate a certain level of voter fraud. One instance of voter fraud is one too many.
Secretary LaRose, with that being said, you ran for this position as a Republican.
Sure.
And so do you believe going forward that the office you hold now shouldn't be a partisan office held?
I think that it's up to the individual to conduct themselves in the office in a way that doesn't make it appear that there's a partisan advantage being taken. That's the way that I've conducted myself. I've, for example, not endorsed candidates and not spoken at rallies and that kind of thing. When I took the oath of office to serve in this capacity, I put on the referee's jersey. Not to be the Republican Secretary of State, but to be the Ohio Secretary of State. And that's something that I take very seriously, because what we do in this office is safeguard the very foundation of our way of life. I mean, and again, I don't mean to be overly dramatic about this, but elections are the very foundation of our government. The only legitimacy that any elected official has comes from the consent of the governed. That's like the basic philosophy of how democracy should work. If you don't have the consent of the governed, you're just a person with a flag and a seal on the wall and a fancy title. It doesn't mean a thing, right? But if you have the consent of the governed, you can do good things as an elected official at the local level all the way up to the presidency of the United States. The only way that we confer that consent of the governed is through a free and fair election that people trust. Can an elected Republican or elected Democrat do that job and do it very well? Absolutely. And the vast majority of my colleagues around the country that serve as secretaries of state do just that. And we're going to keep working hard to make sure that we do just that as well.
This focuses on non-citizens who may have committed fraudulent votes. But looking at the total, how many citizens out there may have fraudulently voted in the election? How does that compare?
Well, again, this is something that whenever an instance like that comes to our attention, we act on it, usually at the county board of elections level. The example that Andrew raised where I think there was a case in Delaware recently. I know, for example, there was a case in Summit County where there was someone who was found to have voted on behalf of a deceased voter. They submitted a relative's ballot when that relative was deceased. When those things come to our attention, we prosecute them. We work with our county boards of elections to refer them to the county prosecutor. But I continue to believe that those instances are rare, but when they happen, it's a serious matter.
But how do they compare a number with this 117?
Oh, again, exceedingly rarely does this happen. But we can look at, historically, a handful of times every year that this is found, and it gets prosecuted. The example from Delaware is a prime example of that. But we're talking about small numbers in a state with nearly 8 million registered voters.
I wanted to ask about the language in the state budget that bars private entities from collaborating with elections officials. How do you envision that affecting the outreach in your office? And I know you've said that you get the impression from talking with legislative leaders that it will not apply to anything that you do per se.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering too if you might think in the future that it could set up the possibility that they may, enforce it differently depending on who's in office.
Yeah, certainly from my conversations with legislative leaders and their staff, that was not their intent. I am very proud of the work that we've done, just like any Secretary of State should do, to get people registered to vote, to encourage participation. Our work with barbershops and beauty salons that we called our Styling for Democracy initiative, it resulted in thousands of voter registrations and poll worker signups, people signing up to be poll workers. Right here in Columbus, I was out at Al Edmondson's barbershop called A Cut Above the Rest, where he had done over 2,000 voter registrations right out of his barbershop here in East Columbus. That's a great example of how those kind of things can work. We partnered with craft brewers all over Ohio for the Raise a Glass for Democracy initiative. That I think there were something like 75 craft brewers in the state that had cans and bottles all throughout the summer and fall last year, reminding people to get registered to vote, and their wait staff had shirts on that reminded people to get registered to vote. Those are great initiatives, and we're going to continue doing those, because one of my most important responsibilities is making sure that Ohioans can access the opportunity to get registered and to cast a ballot. And if somebody wants to challenge my ability to do that, well, then I guess we'll see them in court. That's not my interpretation of the law, certainly.
I just want to understand the timeline here again. So the people registered to vote wrongfully. You said your office identifies them not on that front end when they are actually turning the paperwork, but you sent out 163 letters. That was in between them registering and the election?
Sure.
So your office identified them?
Not between them registering and the election. Maybe I'll just sort of walk through the timeline of it. When you come to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, you prove, it's a binary thing, you either are or you are not a U.S. citizen. When you get a driver's license, when you get a state ID, most of us don't remember the first time we got one of those, but you had to show a birth certificate. Even when you transfer in from another state, you have to prove your citizenship status. So for every Ohioan that has a driver's license, or has and I should say not every Ohioan, but everyone in the state, legally present in the state, who has a driver's license or a state ID, we know their citizenship status. It is a yes or no question. When we knew at a point in time you were a non-citizen, and then after that you conducted some voting activity, such as registering to vote or actually casting a ballot, and then we know at another point in time that you are still a non-citizen, those are the people that fall into this window. So they proved by coming into a BMV that they are a non-citizen. Then they did something that non-citizens are not allowed to do, such as voting or registering to vote. And then they proved again by renewing their driver's license or state ID that they are still a non-citizen, meaning that they had to, by definition, in the intervening period, be still a non-citizen and doing things that non-citizens are not allowed to do. Those are the 117 cases here that we're referring to the Ohio Attorney General's office. Again, what this shows is how very careful we are about making sure that we're not casting too wide of a net here. We are capturing the data of those who we had cause to believe are a non-citizen at this end and a non-citizen at that end, and in the intervening period conducted something that non-citizens are not allowed to do.
So where in the timeline does the letter get sent out?
I think that was out in the spring. We sent, again, 2 letters out. I think the first one went out in February or March, and then one went out subsequent to that.
This year or last year?
This year, yeah.
What kind of mail is this? How do you know that they received the mail?
We send it to their registration address, which is where they are registered to vote. And again, this highlights why it's so important for people to update their registration if they move. This is one of the reasons why we're sort of constantly reminding people how easy it is to go to voteohio.gov and update their address or update their voter registration information. So yeah, it was sent through normal mail to those addresses.
Why do we do this just once a year? Why not do it multiple times a year so that you can catch the person who is wrongfully registered before they have a chance to vote?
Yeah. One of the challenges is that we may not do it within a certain blackout window of a federal election. So for example, there are a small number of cases here, 23 of these 117 who are in the 11th or 15th congressional district, for example. And so those above the 117, there's another 23 that we will be referring after this November's election. Sorry, the 117 are the ones that we're referring now. There are additional 23 that are registered to vote in the 11th or the 15th congressional district, okay? And so we're in that 90-day blackout window because there's a special primary occurring right now and then a general this November. So there is a whole timeline to conducting this, and it takes a while. It's a lot of work on our team. And also, you know, this is the past precedent that we've done it this way on roughly an annual basis, again, taking into account those 90-day federal election blackout windows. But the real solution is not this look back process that we'll continue to conduct, but it is modernizing the process so that there is citizenship verification on the front end. And that's what's included in that verified voter registration, or some call it automated voter registration process that I've been proposing. That's currently, I think it's a component of House Bill 294. But I've introduced it in other forms as well. And that's something that we should get done through the legislature. That's a win-win because it makes it easier for people to get registered to vote and also makes it more accurate by putting things like citizenship check on the front end.
The 23 people that you referred to, have they received letters?
Those 23 have, yeah, those 23 have, but the actual referral will not occur now because they're within that 90-day window.
So because there's that time period in the 2020 election, you're saying we can't do that. So when the 13 or whatever, they walked into the voting booth, let's say on election day, the person that's checking them in or whatever, they're not checking any kind of legalization set. They only see, oh, they're registered to vote, so they're going to go. They don't know.
Sure, that's correct. And remember, part of registering to vote is that you attest that you're a citizen. So you're under penalty of law, you are attesting that you are a U.S. citizen. And so obviously if any of those individuals were to try to cast a ballot again, then they're committing potentially another felony, which could only add to the trouble that they already have. Yeah.
I know in the election bill, there's some language codifying Dropbox rules, but for the 11th and 15th that are going on right now, what is the protocol on how that's being used?
Just as it was last year. And last year, what I did, to be very clear, was expand the use of drop boxes in Ohio more than it's ever been used before. Prior to 2020, really only a handful of counties had the use of them. It was just a very small number, five or six. But now every county has them available. Most counties have multiple available at their Board of Elections office. And those continue to be available 24 hours a day. So when somebody gets off their third shift job tonight, they can swing by their county Board of Elections and drop it off, and it'll be emptied every day by a bipartisan team, and it's under 24/7 video surveillance and all of that.
Do you have an opinion on the 10 days under the bill?
Yeah, and I said this when I was offering testimony in the House a couple weeks ago. That's something I think should be revisited. Listen, there's never a piece of legislation that's necessarily 100% perfect. I have been and continue to be supportive of House Bill 294 because I think it makes some important steps forward, creating online absentee ballot request, modernizing the voter registration process, et cetera. But this is one of the provisions in there that I think should be revisited by the legislature if they're going to move that bill forward.
Do you plan on offering an amendment dealing with the front end verification?
Well, so So that's already in there. So in 294 is an automated voter registration process that we call verified voter registration that would make it a much more streamlined process. The bottom line is this: when you go in to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles office, they already know all the things that it takes to get you registered to vote. They know your name, or address, last four of your social, birth date, driver's license number, all of that. All they should, I mean, with this new system that we're proposing in 294, if they just ask the voter, would you like to be a registered voter? If you say yes, they should have you attest that you're a citizen, sign the screen, and then that gets immediately transferred to the Board of Elections. Effectively, you walk out the door as a registered voter. The way the process works right now, you got to fill out a piece of paper, and then it goes in a box under the counter, and it sits there for a couple weeks, and then it shows up at the Board of Elections office, and they've got to try to decipher your handwriting and do the data entry and everything else. That's already in 294, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a supporter of the bill. It's a big step forward for Ohio.
So these 13 votes, were they counted?
Yes.
Any idea whether or not they made a difference in an election?
That's not something that I would know. Certainly, the margin of victory on the presidential contest was significant here in Ohio, and as you know, sometimes elections come down to close numbers. We had a mayor's race in Stark County a few years ago. I think it was last year, year before, that had to be determined by coin flip. But that highlights why this is important, right? That highlights why we take this seriously. Why the fact that 13 examples of people that are non-citizens casting a ballot is worth our attention, and the fact that why 104 people that are registered to vote that are non-citizens is worth our attention. They're small numbers, but there's no such thing as an acceptable level of election fraud. We're just not going to tolerate it, and there's also that deterrent factor. People need to know that if you are attempting to cast a ballot and you're not a citizen, that we're going to catch you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.